The first 4 Resident Evil games all have a remake. But which ones are better? The originals or the remakes? And which should you play first if you're new to the series? Well, this video is supposed to answer these questions for you in a timely manner. So let's dive into it. Starting with the pioneer of survival horror, Resident Evil 1 and its fantastic remake from just 6 years later. In general, there aren't a lot of aspects in favor of the original because the remake is very faithful. It improves pretty much everything from the original and adds a lot of extra content, like an expanded map, new enemies, extra modes, and some very cool surprises for players of the original. Additionally, there are also the greatly improved graphics, an arguably more eerie and grounded atmosphere, much better, although less hilarious, voice acting, and enhanced gameplay mechanics like the added defense items when getting grabbed by enemies. The remake really deserves to be called the definitive version of Resident Evil 1 because it's just such an amazing way to experience the game. But that also doesn't mean that the original isn't worth checking out. For one, it feels a lot like a cheesy B-horror movie and features some of the best dialogue in the whole franchise, if you don't take it too seriously.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
Which makes the whole game incredibly funny. But on a more serious note, depending on your preferences, some of the improvements from the remake can also work against it and in favor of the original. For example, although the added content is generally well done and can be seen as an improvement, it also stretches out the game a bit and changes the pacing for the worse. Most of the additions cause the game to be more work than the rather straightforward original. You have to backtrack more, getting key items is more complicated, and some paths between areas are way longer than previously. This has the advantage of making the whole game feel more hardcore and more like you're actually trying to survive a nightmare, but can make it feel more tedious as well if you don't like these aspects that much. Apart from that, the original also has a better and in general amazing difficulty curve, with a progressive increase in difficulty and a perfect feel for introducing new enemies. It also isn't very long for today's standards either, making it very accessible and great for learning these types of survival horror games. The remake is just the complete opposite in this regard, because of a vastly more difficult and confusing start with slightly easier following sections and an increased length. Overall, both games are very good, but I'd still recommend going for the remake if you are new to the series. It feels more modern, is available on more platforms, and is all things considered, the better game. But check out the original, either once you played the remake and want to experience why it had such a big impact, or if the remake is too hard for you in the beginning. But not only check out the original, but also the subscribe button to my channel. Wow. According to YouTube, a lot of you haven't subscribed yet, even though you watch the videos, so please do so if you're enjoying this one. Thank you. For Resident Evil 2, it's simultaneously a harder and an easier choice. Both games are great and one of the best in the whole franchise, so it mostly depends on where you are coming from. The remake modernized everything similar to the Resident Evil 1 remake, but much more drastically because of the far more recent release date. The difference in the graphics and audio quality is massive, even though the original fares well for its time and has some incredibly cinematic camera angles. And I can't stress enough how much more accessible the remake is. It controls smoothly and just like any other modern game instead of the old tank controls. They move to a standard over-the-shoulder camera, and stuff like puzzles and key items are much easier to track due to the greatly improved map. But the most famous change is probably the expanded role of Mr. X though. In the original, he shows up a couple of times in the B scenario, but is rather easy to avoid and honestly almost forgettable. In the remake, he's an iconic stalker and does a lot to increase the stress and horror. He's actually so effective that most people interested in gaming have probably heard from him without even considering playing the game. Apart from that, the game also includes remakes of the bonus modes The Fourth Survivor and Tofu Survivor, in addition to some new ones like No Way Out, and keeps the unlockable weapons from the original. In my opinion, the puzzles are a lot more interesting as well, because they pose more of a challenge and you actually have to think about them sometimes. Likewise, I also think that the remake does a better job at balancing the survival horror and action, due to the darker atmosphere, more dangerous enemies and harder puzzles, especially because the original lacked a bit in this area compared to Resident Evil 1 previously. But these two elements are entirely up to your personal preferences, so it could also be that you prefer the original. But speaking about the original, just like for Resident Evil 1, you should not disregard it. Obviously it has some disadvantages due to its age I already talked about, but it also has the vastly superior A-B ones and zapping system. In the original Resident Evil 2, you have to make several choices in the A one, like leaving certain weapons behind or using certain items to prevent or cause certain events. Later in the B1, you will have to deal with the choices you made previously, which can make the playthrough easier or harder depending on what you did. Additionally, the story is a lot more coherent through the different scenarios because they are actually different. In the remake, every scenario is almost the exact same with the same bosses and puzzles. The original also has a few more enemies like the spiders or crows, and a much more noticeable soundtrack with lots of iconic background tracks, especially compared to the remake, which relies almost entirely on ambient sounds only. All in all, I'd recommend the remake for newcomers. It definitely suffers from not having the zapping system, but the improvements make it much more accessible and help to make it a great game despite its shortcomings. But the original is definitely worth checking out as well, especially if you come from Resident Evil 1 and aren't used to the modern Resident Evil games yet. Resident Evil 3 is a completely different story, because the only things the remake has going for it are the modernized controls and graphics, a better dodge system, and improvements to the hospital and some characters like Carlos. Literally every other aspect is much better and more unique in the original. Not only does the original Resident Evil 3 feature a large and interesting Raccoon City with an astonishing variety of different places, lots of very good puzzles, new enemies and never seen before numbers, faster and more fluid controls compared to the first two games, the first Mercenaries, a great soundtrack, and 3 different endings, but also the iconic life selection system and arguably the best stalker enemy in the series. And on top of that, almost everything from enemy placement to puzzle solutions is randomized. The OG Resident Evil 3 is easily one of the best and most replayable games in the franchise. And then there's the remake, removing pretty much everything that made Resident Evil 3 stand out and also everything else. Life selection, gone. Most of the places, gone. Different endings, gone. Most puzzles, gone. Mercenaries, you guessed it, gone. Hell, even Nemesis is barely in the game apart from some boss fights and scripted moments after the first 30 minutes. In opposite to every other game in this video, the remake is a real shame and basically wasted all of its potential. But hey, at least that makes the choice of playing the original or remake easier, because it's clearly the original. I'd only recommend going for the remake if A. the original isn't available on your platform of choice, B. you have already played the original, or C. if you tried the original but couldn't deal with the age mechanics at all. But either way, wait for it to go on sale, because it simply isn't worth the full price. But I also don't want to be too negative, because there's some enjoyment in the remake if you adjust your expectations, so just keep them in check. And now coming to the game which was remade the most recently, Resident Evil 4. And for this one, the choice is much harder again, because both games are arguably equally great. But they still have some key differences, so it depends a lot on your preferences again. This goes so far that pretty much the only indisputable improved elements in the remake are the modernized graphics and controls. Because although it stays pretty true to the original, the remake has some changes that can affect the flow of the game quite a lot. But how about we start with the least controversial change? While the original usually wouldn't allow you to go back to previous areas on your own, the remake gives you quests to complete for extra resources and lets you explore most of the areas freely until you continue on. They also improved Ashley a lot, both in terms of gameplay and her character. I probably liked her more in the original than most do, but she was definitely pretty annoying at times, and her remake counterpart just gets less in the way and has a much more fun personality. Apart from that, there are also added mechanics like stealth and parrying that increase the possibilities of how you can approach some combat scenarios, but are almost entirely optional otherwise. However, like I said, there are also some changes that strongly depend on what you prefer. For example, the original Resident Evil 4's tone and story is very silly. Leon is constantly doing one-liners, seems to be not bothered at all by the circumstances, jokes around with the villains, and just seems to have a pretty good time all around. And the remake still has some of that, but not nearly as much. The whole game is a lot darker, there are more horror elements, and the story focuses far more on Leon's trauma from Raccoon City. Besides that, there's also a slight change to the feel of combat, because the remake lets you shoot while aiming and features bigger and more aggressive groups of enemies compared to the original. Overall, just like I said in the beginning, both games are worth playing and very good. They both succeed very well on their take on Resident Evil 4, the original being a bit more linear and goofy, while the remake goes more in the direction of proper survival horror games, with more exploration and horror, but still staying true to the game's DNA. And while I prefer the direction of the remake, it could be the total opposite for you. So I'd recommend going for the original if you come from the classic Resident Evil games, and I'd recommend the remake if you come from the recent games, because it features the same modernized gameplay and more serious tone. But either way, play both games at some point and you will be happy. So what do you think about the different originals and remakes of Resident Evil? Which ones do you prefer if you played both? Please let me know in the comments. Apart from that, I would also appreciate if you subscribe, like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you and see you next time!